is to.
From last week, Jim, you wanted to give an answer to a question. Is that right?
Yes, someone asked last week, and I'm putting this into the chat. I'm not sure who I'm sending it to, but um, the someone asked a question. We were talking about two wives last week, and someone asked a question about when one word was changed in the big book in Two Wives. And well, I think I can maybe
Mm-hmm.
do this.
Okay.
And and the quote was it's at the end of a chapter. Well, that's not it, sorry. It's at the end of a paragraph in uh, Two Wives.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote says, I'm trying to put it up here. For some reason,
It's already there in the chat.
It's the one you put in the chat.
and it says both in the original manuscript and in the first edition, it says the wives and children of such men suffer horribly, but not less than the men themselves. And in the first printing of the second edition, it says it's on page 128 in the first edition and 114 in the second edition. And it says the wives and children of such men suffer horribly, but not more than the men themselves. And the original manuscript also says less. So it was changed in the first printing of the second edition.
Yeah.
And
Just
that's great, Jim, because you're doing a presentation, aren't you? On
yeah, a presentation tomorrow,
yeah.
afternoon, evening on
Yeah.
the big book history, myths, legends, and changes in the big book.
Right. That's fantastic, Jim. Thank you.
So
yeah.
Yeah. And
And we'll have that with us. You're going to do one for us sometime next month as well, aren't we? We're going to
yes,
get
there'll be this one it's for a group, and so it's a shortened version of what I'll be presenting next month on the 31st, I think, is it?
the end of last week, the last
31st of
Friday of
July.
the month, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Thanks, Jim. So let's go. Bill Sherborg, I'm very disappointed in this, I have to tell you. Where are you? Where's Mr. Sherborg gone? This is not on Zoom.
No, it's not on Zoom. It's in
I'm not
person.
happy with this, Bill. I'm not happy, I have to tell you. Well, who decided to not to let us in?
Well, if you live in the tri-state area, it might be a cool thing to do down to Calvary Church.
It would be. I'd love to go there because why I would love to go there is because there's going to be you, Kevin Hanlon, and Jay Stinnett in the room at the same time with Sally Corbett.
Oh, wow.
And that's the Q&A section. That's going to be a panel discussion after watching Conscious Contact.
Yeah, and then we're going to be there at 6:00 opening. We're going to be signing the books, all four of us.
Wow. How good is that?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to fly up this time.
No, Jay. What Jay did with his lady Janine was take every word that was spoken in the movie and put it into a book with a ton of pictures, just a ton of pictures.
Wow.
And there's some pictures there that nobody's ever seen before that Jay got out of the Stepping Stones archive. So
and the Calvary Episcopal Church you're going to be in because that's where Bill went to.
That's where Sam Shoemaker was.
Sam Shoemaker was.
That was where he met Sam Shoemaker. So, by the way, if the book is now available, so the book is available there. I presume it's on Amazon. I don't know. Jay's supposed to be giving me a copy, so I haven't ordered one.
Was
Bill
that
W.
church on
Conscious
Park
Contact.
Avenue, or was it on? Excuse me. Was that church on Park Avenue or in Gramercy Park?
You're asking the wrong person. I think the answer to both of those questions may be yes. It's on Park Avenue in Gramercy Park, perhaps, but I don't really know.
It says on the flyer. It says on the flyer 61
They don't
Gramercy.
intersect. What, Dave?
Mike, It says on the
What?
flyer 61 Gramercy Park.
Okay.
Yeah, look, Gramercy Park, yeah. So just want to bring that to your attention as well. So can you pass that on to Mr. Stinnett first? I'm not very happy with the Zoom contingent is not very pleased. The Zoom contingent is not- But we're pleased to have you here reading with us, of course, with Jim.
He's at the picnic today. The picnic is today, so
Oh, the picnic is today. That's right. The last day of the picnic today. That's right. I did have a flyer for that.
and they're also doing the there's a play they're doing tonight and twice tomorrow in Bedford Hills.
Oh, play. There you go, the Playhouse. Oh, look at that. Movie and meditation, 9:30 a.m., Bedford Playhouse. Oh, that's the documentary. There's going to be an actual play. Oh, there you go, the theatrical performances. There you go.
Yep.
A true love story made from Lewis and Bill's letters and writings in Stepping Stone's archive. Presented in collaboration with Katona Classic Stage with support from Thrive Bedford, Lewisborough and Pound Ridge. Oh, there's a play as well. So there you go. You can get that is that tonight? June the 4th to the 7th. Yes, tomorrow. Tonight is tomorrow. I just want to mention before we get into reading, I'm really excited about reading chapter 19, the family afterward and the authorship question, because it's wonderful stuff. There's great information in it, isn't it? Again, new way of seeing it. Eamon, you're with us.
Yes, I am here. Yes, thank you so much. Every Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we have a Sunday long-timer speaker meeting where all the speakers are over 40 years sober. And tomorrow we have Brent T. from Squaw Lake, Minnesota, who is 52 years sober, telling us his story of recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Eamon. Thank you very much. So as I said, we've got the author, if you heard the author speaking there, Bill Schaberg, and we've Jim Worley's with us out of A History Only. And we're going to read along with them. So we're on chapter 19, the family afterward and the authorship question. Now, if you've got a closed mind and you've got fixed ideas about AA history, I think you either need to ring your sponsor or you need to really try and have a really work and pray on it. So this is an incredible chapter. And I'm up first. And we're on page 363 and it goes up to 382. So here we go. And we didn't rehearse it. So for the next chapter in the big book, the quote-unquote family afterward, Bill Wilson shifted gears and assumed a new persona, speaking in the voice of the, quote, families of Alcoholics Anonymous, end quote. Under this thin guise, he goes beyond talking about just a wife's role in a husband's recovery and describes at length the changing dynamics in a family confronted with, quote-unquote, fathers' sudden adoption of the sober life, mentioning specific problems they will likely face and offering some solutions based on AA's collective experience up to that time. Given that Bill authored both of these chapters, it is almost, Mr. Schaberg says, comical to see him open, quote, the family afterward, end quote, by backpedaling and undercutting the overprotective suggestions, quote, the wives of Alcoholics Anonymous, end quote, had offered in the previous chapter.
Our women folk have suggested certain attitudes a wife may take with the husband who is recovering. Perhaps they created the impression that he is to be wrapped in cotton wool and placed on a pedestal. Successful readjustment means the opposite. All members of the family must meet upon the common ground of tolerance, understanding, and love.
And Mr. Shepard then goes, he says, so finally we are going to learn something about the newly sober husband's responsibilities along with those of the other family members. Bill Wilson warns that everyone in this newly reconfigured family unit, the alcoholic, his wife, his children, and even his quote-unquote in-laws, will have their own idea about how the new arrangement should work. But if anyone demands that the others concede to their particular vision, it will only result in discord and unhappiness. Instead, each family member must give up the desire to have his or her wishes respected and abandon all attempts, quote, to arrange the family show to his liking, end quote. So rather than each member contentiously trying to arrange these new changes, it is now a question of what each person can give to the family rather than what they can take under this new setup. And the first subheading goes to the obstacles ahead.
With this perilous warning of the pitfalls that lay before each family member, including the newly sober father, Wilson makes a promising proposal, quote, "Suppose we tell you some of the obstacles a family will meet. Suppose we suggest how they can be avoided, even converted to good use for others," end quote. All family members, he cautions, will, quote, "remember when father was romantic, thoughtful, and successful," end quote. "And now that he is sober," quote, "family confidence in dad is riding high," end quote. Everyone thinks, quote, "the good old days will soon be back," end quote. But Wilson states in graphic terms that nothing could be farther from the truth. Quote, "The head of the house has spent years in pulling down the structures of business, romance, friendship, health. These things are now ruined or damaged. It will take time to clear away," end quote, "all that wreckage and perhaps even years to complete the construction of what needs to be built in its place."
And now we go into the confronting the past with the author, Bill Sherbrooke.
So, what is the biggest obstacle the family will face on this new road to sobriety? It is the past.
Now and then, the family will be plagued by specters from the past, for the drinking career of almost every alcoholic has been marked by escapades, funny, humiliating, shameful, or tragic. The first impulse will be to bury these skeletons in a dark closet and padlock the door. The family may be obsessed with the idea that future happiness can be based only upon forgetfulness of the past. Such a view is quite self-centered and in direct conflict with the new way of life.
Quoting Henry Ford, who famously extolled experience as, quote, "the thing of supreme value in life," end quote, Bill notes that this maxim, quote, "is true only if one is willing to turn the past to good account," end quote. But with proper and judicious use, quote, "the alcoholic's past thus becomes the principal asset of the family, and frequently it is the only one," end quote. As such, it must be honestly acknowledged and then used wisely. Such an attitude not only allows the alcoholic to grow in, quote, "willingness to face and rectify errors and convert them into assets," end quote, it is also helpful to other families who are struggling under similar circumstances.
We think each family which has been relieved owes something to those which have not, and when the occasion requires, each member of it who has found God should be only too willing to bring former mistakes, no matter how grievous, out of their hiding places. For in God's hands, the dark past is the greatest possession you have, the key to life and happiness for others.
But before exploring the ways in which the sharing of intimate information between the families of Alcoholics Anonymous actually operates, Bill offers a word of caution about confessing past sexual indiscretions. There are limits to what should and should not be revealed. Sometimes, he says, quote, "in the first flush of spiritual experience," end quote, "partners will confess to extramarital affairs and then forgive each other, only to have the aggrieved party later, quote, "unearth the old affair and angrily cast its ashes about," end quote. These kind of growing pains can hurt a great deal, and they have driven more than one alcoholic back to the bottle. Given this potentially disastrous result, quote, "our rule is that unless some good and useful purpose is to be served, past occurrences are not discussed," end quote. Some parts of the past are just better left buried. However, among members of the fellowship, we, quote, "have few secrets. Everyone knows about everyone else," end quote. Wilson acknowledges that in ordinary life, such intimacy would likely, quote, "produce untold grief," end quote, but because it would invariably lead to, quote, "scandalous gossip, laughter at the expense of other people, and a tendency to take advantage of intimate information," end quote. But among ourselves, he confidently states, these are rare occurrences. We, quote, "do talk about each other a great deal," end quote, he says, "but this talk is tempered by an attitude of love and tolerance. We're also careful to keep whatever confidence someone might share with us to ourselves unless we are sure they would approve. This is critical because if we do not, the criticism or ridicule that may result, quote, has been known to raise the very devil. We alcoholics are sensitive people, and it makes some of us a long time to outgrow that serious handicap.
Economic problems.
Having spent the first third of the chapter on these preliminaries, Bill devotes the middle third to explaining the two basic ways in which a recently sober man typically reacts to his new life. Quote, at the beginning of recovery, a man will, as a rule, take one of two directions. He may either plunge into a frantic attempt to get on his feet in business, or he may be so enthralled by his new life that he talks and thinks of little else, end quote. Bill warns that whichever of these two paths he might choose, certain family problems will arise. Here, the members of Alcoholics Anonymous think they can be helpful because they have hard-won experience with both of these roads so commonly taken by recently sober men. If a new man elects the first course and, quote, rushes headlong at his economic problems, end quote, Wilson suggests it will likely prove to be a mixed blessing. At first, the family members will be delighted because they feel their financial troubles are about to be solved, but they quickly become less pleased, quote, as they find themselves neglected, end quote, by the now tired and preoccupied father. Dad pays little attention to the children, he is inattentive to his wife, and frequently acts out irritably. When the wife and children expecting a much happier home life react critically to these unpleasant changes, resentments grow between family members. Nobody is getting what they want and what they think they deserve from Dad's new life of sobriety. Quote, this sort of thing must be stopped, end quote, Bill states emphatically. Quote, both father and the family are wrong, though each side may have some justification. It is of little use to argue and only makes the impasse worse. To the wife and children, he recommends patience.
The family must realize that Dad, though marvelously improved, is still a sick man. They should thank God he's sober and able to be of this world once more. Let them praise his progress. Let them remember that his drinking wrought all kinds of damage that may take long to repair. If they sense these things, they will not take so seriously his periods of crankiness, depression, or apathy, which will disappear when there is tolerance, love, and spiritual understanding.
But the husband, too, must make some significant concessions and changes.
The head of the house ought to remember that he's mainly to blame for what befell his home. He can scarcely square the account in his lifetime, but he must see the danger of over-concentration on financial success. Although financial recovery is on the way for many of us, we found we could not place money first. For us, material well-being always followed spiritual progress. It never preceded. Since the home has suffered more than anything else, it is well that a man exert himself there. He is not likely to get far in any direction if he fails to show unselfishness and love under his own roof.
With the proper amount of attentive consideration and mutual concern, quote, each member of a resentful family begins to see his shortcomings and admits them to the others, end quote, thereby laying, quote, the basis for helpful discussion. Little by little, mother and children will see they ask too much, and father will see he gives too little. Giving rather than getting will become the guiding principle, end quote.
Spiritual intoxication.
But what if the husband chooses the second path, completely embracing his recent spiritual experience and, quote, overnight becomes a religious enthusiast, end quote? This can be even more disruptive for the family than the man obsessed with financial recovery. Bill describes how this can play out in the alcoholic's freshly minted sobriety.
He's unable to focus on anything else. There's talk about spiritual matters morning, noon, and night. He may demand that the family find God for themselves in a hurry, or exhibit amazing indifference to them and say he is above worldly considerations. He tells mother, who's been religious all her life, that she doesn't know what it's all about, and that she had better get his brand of spirituality while there is yet time.
The family will probably react to this by looking, quote, at their strange new dad with apprehension, then with irritation, end quote. And they may even become, quote, jealous of a God who has stolen dad's affections, end quote. They become critical and, in their neglected state, begin to wonder if dad really is, quote, so spiritual after all. Why all this concern for everyone in the world but his family, end quote. They may even begin to, quote, suspect that father is a bit balmy, end quote. Under these circumstances, Wilson pleads for the family's understanding, pointing out that many members of AA have gone through this same sort of elation and indulged in, quote unquote, spiritual intoxication. Given time, such a man will come to his senses and realize that he's been suffering from a distortion of values and that, quote, his spiritual growth is lopsided, end quote. The wife and children must be patient. With the help of a, quote, sympathetic family, these vagaries of dad's spiritual infancy will quickly disappear, end quote. If, however, the family relentlessly condemns and criticizes him, quote, this fallacy will take a still greater hold on father, end quote, and he will retreat further into himself, believing he has now, quote, become a superior person with God on his side, end quote. Despite his neglect and irresponsibility toward the family, the proper response is to accept these, quote, alarming and disagreeable, end quote, manifestations of his new spiritual life, end quote. Let him go as far as he likes in helping other alcoholics, end quote. In the long run, working with others, quote, will do more to ensure his sobriety than anything else, end quote. The man who takes the spiritual path is building a much firmer foundation for his sobriety than the man who, quote, is placing business or professional success ahead of his spiritual development. He will be less likely to drink again, and anything is preferable to that.
Wilson assures the family that an early overemphasis on the spiritual life is common among newly sober men, but just as common is the eventual recognition of the childishness of this, quote, world of spiritual make-believe, close quote. Once that happens, this, quote, dream world is replaced by a great sense of purpose, accompanied by a growing consciousness of the power of God in our lives, close quote, and of his desire for us to keep our feet firmly planted on the ground where, quote, our work must be done, close quote. In short, quote, we have found nothing incompatible between a powerful spiritual experience and a life of sane and happy usefulness, close quote. Just be patient. Bill's final advice to the wife facing this kind of challenge is to forego any opposition to her husband's new spiritual life and simply join him. It may prove to be the best defense. Quote, nothing will help the man who is off on a spiritual tangent so much as the wife who adopts the self-same program, making a better practical use of it, close quote.
8 more changes to face.
In the final third of The Family Afterward, Bill spends the first 12 paragraphs addressing 8 other, quote, other profound changes, end quote, that the family may face once father has gotten sober.
Struggles over who now wears the family trousers. Liquor incapacitated father for so many years that mother became head of the house. Dad's new outside interests and his resulting absences. Quote, mother and children may demand that he stay home, end quote. The need to balance alcoholic and non-alcoholic friends. Quote, the couple ought to frankly face the fact that each will have to yield here and there if the family is going to play an effective part in the new life, end quote. The possibility of becoming church members. Quote, a helpful suggestion only. There is nothing obligatory about it. Each individual must consult his own conscience, end quote. The insistence on laughter and enjoying life. Quote, we aren't a glum lot. We are sure that God wants us to be happy, joyous, and released, end quote. Recovery of bodily health. Quote, we are convinced that a spiritual mode of living is the most powerful health restorative. but this does not mean that we discourage human health measures, end quote. The possibility of sexual impotence, quote, some of us had this experience only to enjoy in a few months a finer intimacy than ever. We do not know of any case where this difficulty lasted long, end quote. And finally, the need for dad to reclaim his children's love and respect. Quote, in time, they will see that he is a new man, and when this happens, they can be invited to join in morning meditation, end quote.
Additional helpful advice based on AA members' past experiences is offered for each of these problems. In summation, Bill notes that however the family may respond to the obstacles they meet, the alcoholic must continue to live his own life on a spiritual basis. Quote, the others must be convinced by his changed life beyond a shadow of a doubt. He must lead the way. Seeing is believing to most families who have lived with a drinker, end quote.
Sobriety is primary.
This might have been an effective ending for the chapter, but Bill Wilson is unable to let this stirring conclusion stand on its own. Instead, he ends with a real-life story that seems strikingly out of place here and sounds contrary to much of what he has just been said, reverting to the tone and tenor of Two Wives, and once again emphasizing just how much responsibility the wife bears for her husband's sobriety.
Here is a case in point. One of our friends is a heavy smoker and coffee drinker. There was no doubt he overindulged. Seeing this and meaning to be helpful, his wife commenced to admonish him about it. He admitted he was overdoing these things, but frankly said that he was not ready to stop. His wife is one of those persons who really feel there's something rather sinful about these commodities, so she nagged, and her intolerance finally threw him into a fit of anger. He got drunk. Of course, our friend was wrong, dead wrong. He had to painfully admit that and mend his spiritual fences. Though he is now a most effective member of Alcoholics Anonymous, he still smokes cigarettes and drinks coffee. But neither his wife nor anyone else stands in judgment. She says she was wrong to make a burning desire out of such a matter when his more serious ailments were being rapidly cured. First things first. We have two little mottos which are apropos. Here they are: live and let live, and easy does it.
Bill is admonishing that if the wife had only realized that her husband's sobriety was of primary importance, parenthesis, quote, first things first, end quote, close parenthesis, and therefore allowed him to continue indulging in his quote unquote sinful behaviors, parenthesis, quote, live and let live, end quote, close parenthesis, he would never have gotten drunk again. Love and tolerance must be the wife's code. Easy does it, or she will pay the terrible price for finding her husband once more back in the bottle.
Here we go. The myth of collective authorship. With 6 of the 10, quote, general chapters, end quote, now available in rough format, it might be time to pause and consider one of the most pervasive myths in Alcoholics Anonymous, namely that the writing of the big book was a completely collaborative affair, the collective work of the first 100 men who got sober. But that was certainly not true at this point in the story. By the time he had completed the first draft of, quote-unquote, The Family Afterward, Bill Wilson had single-handedly written more than half of what would eventually make up the front portion of the book, and he had done so with little or no substantive input from members of the fellowship other than Hank Parkhurst. Wow. So, recapping what we have already seen from contemporary records, Akron's response right up until the middle of November was simply to say they liked the 6 chapters already sent to them. Given this disappointing lack of response, Bill Wilson complained to Dr. Bob that he wished he, quote, would be more critical of them, for I think they can be improved a lot, he said, end quote. And he elsewhere noted that despite the fact that each of these chapters was sent to Ohio, quote, for debate and inspection, end quote, Dr. Bob, quote, never passed them around very much, merely writing me saying he thought they were all right, end quote. Now, in 1957, Bill Wilson tried to soften this indictment a bit by writing that, quote, copies were sent to Dr. Bob for checking and criticism in Akron, where we had nothing but the warmest support, end quote. A judgment that uses faint praise to veil the fact that Akron may have sent back lots of warm support, but no checking or criticism. Things in New York were a bit different, but not different enough to generate any kind of serious criticism for what Bill had written so far. Quote, I find it is pretty hard, end quote, he told Bob in early November, quote, to get people to voice their real opinions as they are too much afraid of hurting the author's feelings, end quote. Whatever reasons there might be for this New York reticence, the result was that Wilson was writing in a virtual vacuum with little substantive feedback from the group about what he had written. Given this overwhelming evidence for Wilson's sole authorship of the book up to this point, along with his explicit complaints about the lack of input from others, it is perfectly reasonable to wonder where this popular and persistent creation story of an elaborate collaborative writing process for the text of the big book came from.
No one was more complicit in promoting this collective writing myth than Bill Wilson himself, who, after the book was published, increasingly minimized his own responsibility for the text and began to actively circulate the fiction that the book had been written by, quote unquote, we of Alcoholics Anonymous. One reason for this duplicity was the need to bolster the illusion that the book was a report of the collective experience of, quote, 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state, end quote, rather than being just a condensed version of Wilson's personal experiences and observations during the first 4 years of his sobriety, which for the most part is what it was. The power of the communal experience, rather than that of any one individual, was increasingly recognized as one of the most important parts of the message promoted by Alcoholics Anonymous, and it was therefore vitally important that the story of the book's origins be presented as a participatory group effort rather than the work of just one man. In addition to this larger purpose, Bill had an important personal reason for making light of his authorship of the Big Book. As a new method of recovery spread across the country, Wilson grew increasingly uncomfortable with the mantle of sanctity that was constantly being foisted off onto him by these new groups and members. Knowing how much this kind of hero worship played directly into his desire to be, quote, the number one man, end quote, Bill realized he needed to put a number of serious checks on his ego. And one of the ways he did this was to regularly downplay his central importance in the writing of the book.
Great stuff. The role of the New York group.
When talking about the time the Big Book was written, Bill consistently minimized his own part by offering some variation on the fact that, quote, every paragraph of that book, as originally dictated, was torn in shreds and put back again, unquote, by the members of the New York group. Quote, we fought, bled, and died our way through one chapter after another, unquote, he claimed. Emphasizing the early origins of this process, Wilson later wrote about how, quote, the hassling over the 4 chapters already finished had really been terrific. I was exhausted. On many a day I felt like throwing the book out the window, unquote. Jim Burwell, the only other attendee to leave a record of these chapter-by-chapter review meetings, always told a similar story, reporting, for instance, that Bill, quote, would take one copy of each new chapter to the Tuesday night meeting, and he would read it over, and we would chop it apart and give our suggestions, unquote. After which Wilson would, quote, make notes in the margin, unquote, with the changes he would need to make.
How then can this frequently presented picture of extensive substantive editing of the 6 earliest chapters be squared with Bill's complaint to Dr. Bob in early November that he found it, quote, pretty hard to get people in New York to voice their real opinions, end quote, because, quote, they were too much afraid of hurting the author's feelings, end quote. It can't.
The stories Bill and Jim told after the fact were the ones that created the mythology of how the Big Book was written. But those stories are overwhelmingly contradicted by contemporary records. While there was some group criticism later on, it was just not happening at this stage of the writing process, no matter what Wilson and Burwell later said about the matter. Bill's difficulty in getting people to voice their real opinions about these 6 chapters was certainly real, and it had several sources. One cause of the New York members' restraint was the fact that Wilson was such a dominant force in the weekly Brooklyn meetings, where, as he once candidly admitted, quote, "I did most of the talking," end quote. He was, after all, the founder of the movement, the leader of the group, and the man who was fundamentally responsible for each of these men's sobriety. Who else was qualified to speak about alcoholism with such conclusive and uncontested authority? Bill's honest admission of his control over these meetings is consistent with Jim Burwell's recollection of how a typical AA meeting operated in New York during 1938. Quote, "There were 7 or 8 men sitting around in a circle, and Bill Wilson sat in the center. He would do all the talking, and we would do all the listening and answering the questions because he had all the book sense." Elsewhere, close quote. Elsewhere, Jim elaborated on this picture by noting, quote, "It was a round table discussion with Bill in the center, and everybody was shooting at him and getting what information he had, what he had gotten from his books. We thought he was really a walking encyclopedia on alcohol. There were only 4 or 5 books, and Bill had read them all."
This hardly sounds like an open forum meeting with multiple opportunities to offer significant criticism of what the founder had just written on the nature of alcoholism and the problems facing the newly sober man. Another problem with the scenario painted by both Wilson and Burwell is the sheer difficulty of having Bill read each new chapter out loud from the only available copy, and then expecting each member to make substantive and helpful critiques, paragraph by paragraph, after he was finished. It's worthwhile to pause and think about exactly how this might have worked. Did the members make notes about what they thought could or should be changed as Bill read? Or did they rely on their memories to recall those things that needed improvement, bringing them up individually once he had finished reading? Or did they just interrupt Wilson as he went along, stopping him whenever they heard something objectionable or that they thought needed to be changed? It is quite frankly hard to imagine any of these scenarios being the least bit plausible or fruitful given the known dynamics of the Brooklyn meetings. And finally, how much did they really care? Were they so concerned about Bill Wilson had written that they would be willing to openly challenge him on any of these seemingly incidental issues? Everything he had written in the 6 chapters up to the family afterwards could be characterized as either a detailed diagnosis of the disease of alcoholism or a summary of the problems the alcoholic would face in getting and staying sober. These were, as Bill noted, general chapters covering a wide variety of topics, and it is unlikely that members of the Tuesday night group would find any of this so questionable that they would challenge the man who was not only their leader, but also the man who readily acknowledged as having the most knowledge of the disease. The first 6 chapters probably generated little more criticism in New York than they did in Ohio. Bill's comprehensive explanation of the alcoholic's problem just wasn't controversial enough to generate critical attacks from these New York members. Whatever group criticism he did receive, which Wilson claimed he had been looking for all along, did not begin in earnest until December when he rolled out 2 new chapters, How It Works and Into Actions, with the 12 steps, his numbered solution to the alcoholic's problem. Bill's concise articulation of what must be done to get and stay sober was something the New York members were willing to argue about. Whatever truth there may be in the supposed quote-unquote real mauling given to every paragraph by the New York contingent, it would have to wait for the appearance of these chapters containing the 12 steps along with Wilton's detailed instructions on how to go about applying them to your life. But even here, as shall be detailed later, The group was not the main source of these criticisms, nor did most of it come from the Tuesday night meeting. Hank Parkhurst, along with, to a lesser degree, Fitz Mayo, were the primary critics, and their objections or suggestions for changes occurred in private discussions with Bill, some surely in Brooklyn, but most in the Newark office of Honor Dealers. Other than this, there is no credible evidence for any such significant participatory group criticism of what Wilson had so far written for the book.
Amazing, amazing. Input 3 months before printing.
However, there is one plausible scenario for some significant group input that may have been at work before mid-November and was part of the review process during the final 3 months before the multilith copy was printed in mid-February 1939. Bill Wilson's statement about the difficulty of getting people in New York to offer their real opinion does not necessarily mean there were absolutely no suggestions for changes during those final months as the book moved towards completion. Given Bill's specific claim that there was no strong criticism that might, quote, hurt the author's feelings, end quote, being voiced at this time, we can be fairly confident no one was standing up at these Tuesday night meetings and saying things like, quote, Billy, you just got that wrong, end quote, or, but, quote, but you just can't say that, end quote, or even less personal, quote, so what is that supposed to mean, end quote.
But this does not preclude the possibility that people would listen attentively as Bill Wilson read each new chapter and then offer thoughtful suggestions for additional material that might be added to what they had just heard. Given Bill's stature and recognised primacy within the Brooklyn group, this scenario presents a much more believable picture of how the editing process may have actually operated in New York City in late 1938. Rather than a free-for-all in which every paragraph was violently, quote, pulled apart and suggestions added by all those present, end quote, readings most likely concluded with one or more members making an observation along the lines of, quote, Hey, Bill, how come you didn't say anything about X or Y or Z in there, end quote, or, you know, Bill, what else might fit well into this chapter, end quote. This, quote, easier, softer way, end quote, of reviewing the chapters and respectfully offering suggestions for additional text would have avoided hurting the author's feelings while still allowing members to make reasonable contributions to the rapidly growing text.
Because we have neither the quote-unquote once corrected dictations mailed to Akron in September and November, nor any of the interim versions between them in the following February, it is impossible to say exactly when the New York group might have started offering these kind of recommendations and requests for additional material. In early November, when Wilson bemoaned the lack of significant input, he may have been specifically referring to criticism of what he had already written rather than these sort of suggested additions. But as noted above, if this less critical add-on process was not operative before mid-November, it did come into play sometime soon after that. The notion that the New York input was more about adding material than criticizing what had already been written is supported by a careful reading of the texts in these earlier chapters. For instance, there are a number of places in the 3 chapters just considered where paragraphs or sections seem to have been tacked on or feathered into the chapters Bill was reading to the group on Tuesday nights. These suspected add-ons stand out as abrupt and unexpected changes in direction, at times almost non sequiturs, or because they sound more like a misplaced afterthought rather than logical extension of what comes immediately before it. Consider, for example, the final 11 paragraphs in Working with Others, which shifts the chapter's perspective from detailed instructions on how to properly deliver the message of recovery to a new man, and suddenly begins to extol the benefits that come to the sober man who is now spiritually fit, elaborating on the fact that he can, quote, do all sorts of things alcoholics are not supposed to do, end quote. As noted earlier, the purpose of this section is to differentiate the sober AA member from all of the noisy temperance and prohibition preachers that have preceded him and to detail the many strengths and opportunities available to him now that he has God on his side, keeping him safe from the first drink, even in a variety of previously dangerous situations.
While it may have been Wilson's original plan to have a section such as this close the chapter, the subject matter shifts so dramatically from the presentation to the presenter, all but abandoning the topic of working with others, that it sounds distinctly like something added later. The shift here may be because Bill couldn't think of a more effective close for working with others, but it's just as likely that it appears here because someone suggested this type of information should be included somewhere in this chapter, so Wilson just added it on at the end. The same premise might explain the inclusion of those two strident paragraphs that appear so abruptly just before the conciliatory conclusion of Two Wives. The "even your hatred must go," end quote, paragraph doesn't just flow logically from the talk of spirituality that immediately precedes it, and this is followed by an even more abrasive admonition to, quote, "never, never try to arrange his life," end quote. Both of these paragraphs show a significant shift in tone and seem distinctly out of place in relation to what the wife has just been told, making it probable they were written after the fact and then dropped in here to satisfy the suggestion that the closing needed to be much more forceful, dramatic, and explicit if it was ever going to make a real impression on the wife. Similarly, The Family Afterwards ends with the unfortunate, quote-unquote, case in point story of the man who drinks after being nagged by his wife about his, quote-unquote, sinful overindulgence in cigarettes and coffee. How this story relates to what immediately precedes it, the well-organized and detailed explanation of 8 profound changes that can be anticipated when a man first gets sober, is something of a mystery. Most likely, it was Wilson's response to some New York member insisting that this instructive story should be included. Each of these examples displays a sudden change of direction, disrupting the logic and the flow of what came before it. Readers confronted with this kind of jumbled presentation in the Big Book frequently conclude that Bill Wilson just wasn't a very good writer. But perhaps the fault lies less in a lack of writing skills on the part of the book's primary author and more on the much-touted collaborative creation process of the Big Book.
Brilliant. Hank Parkhurst's contributions.
Hank Parkhurst was, however, another story completely. Unlike the other New York members, Hank did not have to wait until Tuesday night for a first look at what Bill Wilson was writing. He was sitting right there in the small honor dealer's Newark office, listening, criticizing, and offering his opinions as Bill and Ruth created first drafts of each new chapter. Ruth tells us Bill would arrive in the office with, quote, yellow scratch pad sheets with a few notes to guide him on a whole chapter. And these notes were the result of long thought on his part after hours of discussion, pro and con, with everyone who might be interested, end quote. Ruth's choice of words here about Bill consulting with, quote unquote, everyone who might be interested is worth noting because it provides at least some evidence that not everyone was interested in talking about the book, or at least not in relation to these 6 early chapters.
Having arrived in Newark with these few notes in hand, it's hard to believe Bill would or even could have avoided a discussion with Hank about them before he began dictating to Ruth. Who besides Wilson himself was more interested in what was going into each new chapter of the book than Parkhurst? Hank was genuinely passionate about the content of the Big Book and deeply committed to creating something that would effectively present their message of recovery to the world and do so in such a way that the book would become an instant bestseller. His own financial future and the all-important ability of Alcoholics Anonymous to become self-supporting through large sales of the book absolutely depended upon it. Parkhurst was the person closest to Wilson as he composed these critical first dictations, a fact Bill later freely acknowledged, calling Hank his quote-unquote partner in the book enterprise, end quote, a partnership that was not limited to their mutual involvement in the business side of the project. Parkhurst's continual presence during the actual writing of the book in Newark provided him with more chances to influence Wilson than anyone else in the fellowship, and he seized that opportunity by arguing with Bill for his particular point of view on recovery. As we have seen, Hank was never bashful about offering his own thoughts. On the all-important topic of what should go into the book, he wasted no time in effectively advocating for his own perspective, first by submitting his quote-unquote contradictory ideas to Bill in early June, and then by creating his prophetic outline of the book a couple of weeks later. A lively dialogue between the two men surely continued over the next 3 months, but when Bill finally returned to writing the book in mid-September, Hank was given the golden opportunity of speaking his mind with specific regularity.
Beyond Bill's own testimony, the fact that Hank made substantial contribution to the book is confirmed by Ruth Haack, the only other person who was an eyewitness to this process. When specifically asked about Parkhurst's input, she readily admitted he was present throughout the Newark writing period and claimed that he, quote, contributed a lot of ideas, end quote, to the book, and then added emphatically, quote unquote, he really did. However, Bill was not very receptive to most of Hank's comments and suggestions. Beyond the running arguments over content, style was also an issue. As noted earlier, Hank had recently taken a writing school course, after which he was constantly advising Bill on how to improve his prose style. These suggestions did not sit particularly well with Wilson, who later noted rather bluntly that in this regard he, quote, didn't go for Hank's advice very much, end quote.
Hank loses the God argument.
Well, much more confrontational were Parkhurst's contrary opinions about what should and should not be going into the book. He had strong convictions that Wilson had been unable to change over the past several months. For example, Hank was still opposed to the strong religious slant Bill was giving to their solution, and he continued to advocate for his June position that, quote, religion, etc., should not be brought, end quote, into the picture when describing their method of getting sober. Wilson claims that during this early period, Parkhurst even went so far as to demand, quote, the word God be deleted from the book entirely, end quote. It is hard to imagine a position any further from what Bill was then writing for the big book. But Hank decisively lost that argument, and he clearly did so early on, as can be seen from even a cursory reading of the first 6 chapters so far written. A quick search of those chapters, as printed on just 39 pages of the multilith copy, finds 69 instances of the word God, and that does not take into account any of the references to the divine he or him, nor to any of the other names for the providential deity that appear so frequently in these pages. Given the ubiquity of the word God and similarly regular references to the Supreme Being, it is hard to imagine that Bill made any effort at all to tone down the number of explicit references to God in response to Hank's criticisms. On this issue, he completely dismissed Hank's arguments for a purely, quote unquote, irreligious approach and remained faithful to his original plan of presenting a basically religious solution to the problem of alcoholism. As with Parkhurst's critical comments about his writing style, Bill obviously didn't go for Hank's advice very much when it came to his suggestions for a basically non-religious approach.
God plus moral psychology.
In opposition to Bill's strong emphasis on God, Hank had lobbied for a purely psychological explanation of their solution, one that was firmly based on the moral psychology of ego reduction and a life of increased usefulness to others. We are actually irreligious, but we are trying to be helpful. We have learned to be quiet, to be more truthful, to be more honest, to try to be more unselfish, to make the other fellow's troubles our troubles, and by following 4 steps, we, most of us, have a religious experience. The fellowship and selfishness appeals to us. Bill actually agreed with most of this, recognizing Dr. Silkworth's ideas on moral psychology as a critical element in any meaningful and sustained recovery. But he didn't feel it was sufficient by itself for keeping someone sober. Wilson's model for gaining and maintaining sobriety was a much more balanced approach, incorporating spiritual, psychological, and physical parts, but with the greatest emphasis being placed firmly on the spiritual. Still, his agreement with the real need for ego reduction and a life redirected toward usefulness to others made it easy for Bill to include any number of references to the importance of moral psychology in what he wrote, noting in just one dramatic example that the recovered man's main job was to, quote, be of maximum helpfulness to others, unquote. Beyond frequent references throughout these 6 chapters to the need to get outside of oneself and to become a useful participant in society, one chapter, Working with Others, was devoted almost exclusively to usefulness and little else.
Under these circumstances, it's impossible to say how much of the moral psychology and the regular emphasis on usefulness to others found in Bill Wilson's writing should be credited to Hank Parkhurst. But with Bill's lavish inclusion of Hank's beloved psychological and altruistic element in the text, it would hardly be fair to say that Parkhurst lost all his arguments with Wilson about the content and tone of the big book. Bill was willing to emphasize the psychological aspect Hank considered so singularly important, agreeing that it was indispensable for recovery, but he just wasn't willing to abandon his belief in the central importance of religion or to remove the constant mentions of God as a critical and essential element of the solution. In the end, Bill clung to these spiritual elements, but he did blend them with the psychological solution that could be found so generously sprinkled throughout each of the chapters he wrote.
With this fundamental disagreement raging between them, these ongoing arguments could not have been easy for either man to navigate. The honor dealer's office in Newark became the battleground where the biggest fights over the big book were actually waged. More than in meetings, this was certainly the place where Bill Wilson and Hank Parkhurst, quote, fought, bled, and died their way through one chapter after another, end quote. And perhaps even where, quote, every paragraph of that book as originally dictated was torn in shreds and put back again, end quote. Hank was that sort of combative guy, and he was hardly likely to restrain himself for fear of hurting the author's feelings. Within the confines of their small office, the outright rejection of both his stylistic suggestions and his exclusively non-religious solution must have caused more than a little anguish. Under these circumstances, it is not hard to imagine why Bill later claimed that, quote, on many a day I felt like throwing the book out the window, end quote. And perhaps Henry G. Parkhurst along with it. But Hank was nothing if not tenacious. Despite the fact that Bill consistently ignored so many of his ideas, Parkhurst would continue to fight for the inclusion of his own perspective and presentation wherever they might fit in, right up until the final hours before the book actually went to press.
Addressing marital infidelity.
Besides the 3 suspicious tacked-on endings already mentioned, there are several other places where paragraphs appear to have been incorporated into what was already written for the big book. One further example found in The Family Afterward should be mentioned in this regard for its multifaceted importance. In that chapter, Bill says that sober members and their wives who have wrestled with marital problems, quote, should be only too willing to bring forward mistakes, no matter how grievous, out of their hiding places, end quote, and to share them with the new member and his wife. These revelations, along with the story of their successful resolution, are essential for showing newcomers how they can gain victory over such terrible family problems. However difficult and counterintuitive it may sound, Wilson encourages sober members to speak openly and candidly with others about these delicate family matters because, quote, in God's hand, the dark past is the greatest possession you have, the key to life and happiness for others. With it, you can avert death and misery for them, end quote.
Skipping the next paragraph for the moment, Bill opens the following paragraph by noting that AAs have few secrets and that, quote, everyone knows all about everyone else, end quote. An observation that flows smoothly and logically from, quote, the dark past is the greatest possession you have, end quote. Comment just noted. It continues the thought and fits perfectly into the point Bill is trying to make about the need for group members to be open and candid with each other, up to and including the sharing of their darkest secrets. Complete openness and honesty about past family difficulties is, he says, one of the most important and critical ways he can be truly useful and helpful to each other. We can be truly useful and helpful to each other. However, sandwiched between these two paragraphs, there is another that takes a sudden and unexpected turn into the question of marital fidelity. It is possible to dig up past misdeeds so they become a blight, a veritable plague. For example, we know of situations in which the alcoholic or his wife have had love affairs. In the first flush of spiritual experience, they forgave each other and drew closer together. The miracle of reconciliation was at hand. Then, under one provocation or another, the aggrieved one would unearth the old affair and angrily cast its ashes about. A few of us have had these growing pains, and they hurt a great deal. Husbands and wives have sometimes been obliged to separate for a time until new perspective, new victory over hurt pride could be re-won. In most cases, the alcoholic survived this ordeal without relapse, but not always. So our rule is that unless some good and useful purpose is to be served, past occurrences are not to be discussed.
This small, self-contained side trip is directly contrary to the prior advice of being candid about, quote unquote, the dark past. It abruptly interrupts the argument being made about the necessity of talking openly about difficult family problems within the group and introduces an entirely different scenario, the question of how to talk or not talk with your spouse about past marital infidelities. This is certainly important information, but it is distracting to Bill's point about one couple helping another, and it really does not fit in here, parenthesis, although it might be as good as any other place to drop this delicate subject into the chapter, close parenthesis. The question of how to deal with the admission of past infidelities, parenthesis, or the revelation of details should those infidelities already be known, close parenthesis, is certainly a common problem for many newly sober men, and it is mentioned several times in the Big Book, this being perhaps the most direct and explicit. As a caution to the new man, it makes sense that this point should be made somewhere in this discussion, but it appears here is more of a distracting aside than an element in Bill's main point. It's almost as if someone had said, quote, listen, Bill, if you're going to talk about couples making revelations about the dark past, then you had better make sure people understand you're not talking about that part of the dark past, end quote, and Wilson complied. If that explanation is as plausible as it seems, then the next question would be, who and what might have prompted this insertion? The suggestion may well have come from someone at the Tuesday night meeting making a comment similar to the one noted above, but there are a number of other possible candidates.
Bill's sexual past a factor?
For instance, Bill Wilson himself may have decided after the fact that just such a paragraph was needed here. Certainly he was no stranger to the problem. The question of his own possible infidelities while drinking was one he had addressed, however circumspectly, in each of his 3 versions of Bill's story.
Though I managed to avoid serious scrapes and partly out of loyalty, extreme drunkenness, I had not become involved with the fair sex. There were many unhappy scenes in my apartment. That's from the original story version. There were many unhappy scenes in our apartment. There had been no real great infidelity. Loyalty to my wife and sometimes extreme drunkenness kept me out of those scrapes. And that's from the May and June 1938 version. And there were many unhappy scenes in our sumptuous apartment. There had been no real infidelity, for loyalty to my wife, helped at times by extreme drunkenness, kept me out of those scrapes. That's what appears in the Multilith edition version.
There's an interesting progression here from extreme drunkenness being partly the reason for not becoming involved with other women to indulging in no great infidelity out of loyalty to Lois and, quote, sometimes extreme drunkenness to no real infidelity because of loyalty and, quote, it at times extreme drunkenness. Whatever indiscretions Wilson may have committed while drinking, he was clearly not about to admit them in print, nor is it likely he ever made any admissions of guilt beyond this when talking to his wife, Lois. Still, the careful reader has to wonder just how far a potential relationship would have to go before, quote-unquote, extreme drunkenness, parenthesis, that is, either passing out or impotence, close parenthesis, became a saving factor preventing the betrayal of one's marriage vows. It is equally interesting to speculate how, on exactly what kind of behavior short of intercourse, parenthesis, or even including intercourse, close parenthesis, might still allow the claim to, quote, no great infidelity, end quote, or, quote, no real infidelity, end quote, in the mind of a 1938 American male. One must wonder, too, about Lois's reactions when she first read each of these different versions. But whatever stories Bill had been telling Lois about his relationship with other women during his drunken years, she was clearly not buying it, for in each of these stories, there is only one phrase that repeats in each of these versions, namely, quote, the, quote, many unhappy scenes, end quote, that were played out between Bill and Lois at home whenever he finally did get home. In short, if Bill had been unfaithful during his drinking days, he was obviously following his own advice about non-disclosure, for he clearly never owned or disclosed that behavior to his wife.
Ruth and Hank have a vested interest in the topic.
Another possible candidate is Ruth Hawk, who had taken a semester-long short story writing course at NYU along with Hank Parkhurst around this time. Having done so, she may have naturally felt qualified to offer comments and suggestions to Bill Wilson as he wrote. Parenthetically, actually, it would be hard to imagine her not doing this to some degree throughout the free-form writing process in which she played such a prominent role, into parentheses. The question of whether or not to discuss past indiscretions was certainly something that Ruth had heard more than a little office talk about over the years. In fact, 40 years later, she was still able to recount one harrowing Oxford Group story she had overheard about the real pitfalls inherent in these delicate situations.
Is Gigi?
You mean
Kit, you keep reading, Kit.
okay.
Sorry.
Oh, there you are.
Got it.
One of
Okay.
the Oxford Group's basic tenets was that if you had ever harmed anyone at all in any way, you were to go to that person, confess everything, and apologize. Do your best to make up for whatever had happened. The only trouble Bill found with that was that, and this happened actually twice in the New York area, where men had done this. In one case, the man explained to his wife that he'd been unfaithful with this lovely girl who lived right across the street, but it would never happen again, and he was sorry, and so on. Well, the first thing that happened, of course, overcame the husband of the lovely girl. Then this story began to go from whisper to whisper, from one to another, and you don't keep that kind of thing secret. The minute you spread it that way, and anyway, there was a great deal of trouble about it. And that's when they began to realize that maybe that wasn't the best thing in the world, to be so candid if it hurt the other person.
While an awareness of these Oxford Group failings could have prompted a suggestion from Ruth about including this cautionary paragraph in The Family Afterward, there might have been another, more personal reason for her wanting this plea for secrecy about extramarital affairs to be included in the book. Hank Parkhurst was known to have considerable troubles with marital infidelities throughout his life. While details about his past, in parentheses, and future, in parentheses, dalliances are frequently anecdotal, Hank's marriage to Kathleen was deteriorating severely at this time, so much so that they would separate several months after this, and she would successfully file for divorce on September 23, 1939. As Lois wrote, quote, "For some time, Hank's marriage had been not going well. He had many arguments with Kathleen, and they were planning to get a divorce," end quote. Lois was actually part of that divorce filing, an unexpected thing given her husband's close relationship with Hank. But Lois did submit an affidavit at Kathleen's urging, in which she noted, among other things, that Hank had been separated from his wife for 10 weeks in early 1939 and had been living with the Wilsons at 182 Clinton Street during that time. As Hank's attention wandered from Kathleen, he began to focus more and more on his own secretary, the very attractive Ruth Hawk. In support of Lois's story about Hank moving in with them for 10 weeks in early 1939, Ruth later claimed that Parkhurst, quote, had broken up with his wife just prior to the Cornwall press trip, and bracketed, that is, the final week of March 1939, end of brackets, and soon thereafter began making overtures to me, end quote. This date for the start of their affair is most likely self-serving because Hank had almost certainly been pursuing Ruth for several months at that point. Lois, for instance, mentions that his marriage, quote, had not been going well for some time, end quote, implying the affair had begun well before the Cornwall trip took place. In addition, Hank being thrown out of his own house in early January would strongly suggest that the affair started sometime prior to that.
In this regard, it is important to note that Parkhurst's overtures were not unwelcome at first. Ruth was very open to them. Quote, "I thought highly of Hank," close quotes, at that time, she said, "and we," quote, "were very interested in each other," close quote. While the exact date their affair started is unknown, Ruth said that throughout this time, Hank, quote, "was just an unhappy man. And as Bill used to say, when you're unhappy, be careful because you're getting into trouble." And Hank was, close quotes, doing just that, with Ruth Hawk's encouragement. Hank wanted her to become his wife, she said, and she candidly admitted, quote, "I had at one time seriously considered marrying him," close quote. But once he started drinking again, quote, "marriage became an impossible thing for us," close quote, and the entire affair was over and done with by the fall of 1939. Since Hank had pursued his divorce from Kathleen with every intention of marrying Ruth, this reversal of her affections caused some serious problems for both of them, and also for Bill Wilson, who found himself caught squarely in the middle of this illicit affair.
Under these circumstances, both Hank Parkhurst and Ruth Hawk would have had a vested interest in making this addition to the text, one which explicitly absolved the adulterous partner from the need to candidly confess their transgressions to his wife. And either or both of them may well have lobbied for the insertion of this new paragraph into The Family Afterwards. But whoever may have been responsible for the addition of this particular paragraph, it will have to serve here as just one, but far from the only example of the type of ongoing edits being done to the text of the Big Book before it was finalized for the multilith printing in mid-February 1939.
Wow, end of chapter 19, The Family Afterward, and the authorship question. If you'd like to unmute and acknowledge the readers and, of course, the chapter.
Great job,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
Thank you.
Great writing, Bill.
Thanks,
Perfect.
Bill.
Thank you, readers.
Thank you, everyone. Much appreciated. Bill, I have to go straight into this one because this was, when I read this chapter, the myth of collective authorship, I have to ask you a little bit more about this. Can you explain where you found all this information, or was it difficult to find all that information? Could you just share a little bit more snippet on it for me? I think it's incredible reading.
Well, David, the contemporary documents support the fact that Wilson was doing this writing, and people weren't. I mean, he literally says to Dr. Bob, I'm having trouble getting these people to say anything to me here in New York. And we know damn well we got two great quotes from Bill Wilson saying he got basically nothing back, from Akron. So those are things that Wilson wrote at the time. And then there's the stuff that was said afterwards. This whole idea that, Wilson was the guy who was running the Tuesday meeting and everybody kind of, kowtowed to him, that he was the guy who knew everything. So they had questions, but they weren't doing corrections on him. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me, except for Hank Parkhurst and Fitz Mayo to some degree. Fitz was looking for a much more singularly religious slant to this thing. What really wasn't until, we're talking about the first 6 chapters here. And in many ways, I read stuff here that I would phrase differently, at least. As you well know, when I started doing that presentation on working with others, it came to me that Wilson thought he was done when he finished that. And the book doesn't reflect that in the text. Although it seems to be hinted at a couple of times, that's what's going on. Parkhurst, I don't think he got, let's face it, if in fact it's true that with the first 6 chapters, Wilson there is a solution, I laid it out, and there was there is the diagnosis that if you're a real alcoholic, you have no defense against the first drink, more about alcoholism. Oh, you need to get yourself a vital religious experience, we agnostics, and by the way, when all that fails, then you need to be working with others. So that's all kind of loose and goosey kind of thing, it's kind of soft. It's not specific. In the book that started it all, you can clearly see at least 3 times, maybe 4 times, Hank's written the mold. He thought that the 12 steps were way too goddamn specific. He was okay with he wasn't happy, but he could live with those first 4 chapters before the 2 wives. I think he was on that level. But when Wilson comes out with these 12 steps, he's like, whoa, mold, we can't be doing that. You can't be that specific. You're back into the Oxford group crap, blah, 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 too groupy at times, he says, in the thing. So I think there's this whole there's different dynamics in play here. This is my understanding, and my understanding that I get from the texts that I read that are contemporary and things that were said afterwards, that there's a whole different dynamic between before the first week of December and after the first week of December, because that's when he wrote the 12 steps. And of course, chapters 5 and 6, which talk about steps 11, 12. I'm sorry, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. They're explicitly in there. And Hank's bitching that's too directive, rather than those very kind of soft and suggestive earlier 3 chapters that I just pointed out. 4 chapters if you want to throw in there is a solution. So that whole mold thing, I think I would. If I was rewriting this chapter, the tone would change in certain places and the emphasis would change in certain places. But we're stuck with this book, and I'm not making any more changes to it. That's the end of the story.
Bill, can I just I just love the way you tore the scenario painted by both Wilson and Burwell. You said, and then you said, just picture them reading the book and asking Bill, what do you mean by that, or change that? The way you just stripped that apart was wonderful.
Yeah, well, you just stop and think about it. It's like, how would that work? How'd that play out? And there's that wonderful thing from Tom Burrell, who was in a meeting in December of 1938 when Wilson's coming in and reading, obviously, from chapters 5 and 6. And they're saying, oh, put in a comma there and put a question mark over here. And maybe you want to throw this in, Bill. Well, I love that. Maybe you want to throw this in, Bill, because I think, I don't know. I was raised... My sponsor, who was a college philosophy professor, taught me how to read. He really, really taught me how to read. And there's So there's this, if you're reading John Stuart Mill, man, there's a logical progress, and one of the questions he would ask, I think I've said this here before, he would ask people in class was, why does paragraph 7 come after paragraph 6 and not before it? Well, there's a logical progression of those things. And if you pay attention to those texts critically and carefully, that's what you see. And so, I mean, I bring that kind of reading skill set to this book when I'm reading it. And I'm like, all of a sudden, as far as I'm concerned, the text is grinding gears and going into a different shift, it's shifting into a different place. And then it comes back again. Or that, I love that story about the guy who drank because his wife was bitching about his cigarette smoking and, Jesus, coffee drinking, and I can really, I can hear somebody saying at the Tuesday night meeting to Bill, hey, Bill, you know what? You remember Harry who drank again because, you should put Harry's story in there. That'd be right there, And I think Wilson, he wasn't rejecting every kind of criticism he was getting, but he was fighting a rearguard action with Hank Parkhurst, absolutely, for sure. So no doubt about it. Just one little thing, I don't know. I've been tutoring somebody, and we were reading The Will to Believe by William James, 1898 essay, The Will to Believe, which I think Wilson read very carefully, to tell you the truth. But she pointed out to me that it says at the very end, live and let live. And I was like, whoa, I've never noticed that was stuck in that I think it's the last paragraph of that particular essay that he wrote. It's only about a 25-page essay. And I said, oh, I wonder, we always talk about Bill Wilson stealing stuff from the Common Sense of Drinking, for instance, almost word for word. Well, I think maybe live and let live came out of William James's The Will to Believe. But we're in speculation zone here, so.
Thank you, Bill. And did you want to make another comment other than that before we go to Jim?
No, I do enough talking, David.
Oh, no, not here. You don't. Jim Worley.
Thanks, Dang. A great chapter. Is it really sexual infidelity? Not to be political, but it depends on what the meaning of is.
Oh, right.
At least Americans will probably get that one. But anyway, yeah, I don't want to get into that. Yeah, I'm doing this presentation tomorrow, and it's on the big book, myths, legends, and guess where I picked up all of my information on myths and legends in the big book, and I mean, obviously, from writing the big book and all of the things that I think most of us here have learned over the last 6 years and 7 or 8 times of reading the book and together. There are just so many things that I thought were true. I mean, I had heard it. I had heard these things all my sober life, and I assumed that they were all true. And then there are some of them that aren't, and in learning, what the truth is sometimes it's uncomfortable. And, I want to kind of justify what, so-and-so told me or what I read in such and such a book. But actually learning what really happened, things like, the big one that we talked about this week was the myth of collaborative authorship. Yeah. 100 people got together and wrote this book. And that's what most people have heard and what they believe. And which just means that Bill Wilson got what he wanted. He wanted people to think that this was a collaborative effort, of a bunch of people and not just one man's, opinion about what had happened. And, just the fact that it mentions 100, we know that it wasn't 100, that Bill liked to round up, so all of these things, are really, I think, important to know and to pass on. So, again, just a great book, and just always, an honor to read it and learn something else new. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And David, I'd just like to make one more comment about, Bill Clinton saying it depends on the definition of is. I mean, that's a little philosophical and otherworldly, but I can remember at least 2 AA meetings I have been in my life where the guy running the meeting was having little problems at home. But telling us about those problems at home, he clearly defended and explicitly said, blowjobs don't count. That's not infidelity. I mean, I can't believe I couldn't believe it at the time. I can't believe it now. But I've been in that room where a guy was making that argument because that's the world he lived in. So I don't know what Bill Wilson was talking about here. But if you think he wasn't playing with the is there, anyhow.
Thank you for that. Of course, Jim Worley's with A History Only, Facebook page, which we're very thankful for, Jim, all your service you're doing in there, informing and educating us all. Well, me anyway, definitely. Marty B is in DC, and Marty is a hand raised.
Yes, thanks everybody for all that you did. It was really wonderful. I love this book, Bill, and I shared for a month from it to a group I'm in, and people were like just gobsmacked. I can't help but wonder if part of the reason that Bill Wilson contradicted to an extent what he wrote into the wives in this chapter so that he looks like the good guy, and that it's the wives who were saying, you must do this, you must do that, and the like. I don't know. What's your take on it?
Well, yeah, I think this is just a continuation. Now, when it opens up, it really, the first thing he kind of tries to dial back some of that stuff,
Yeah.
I think before he wrote, no, I'm speculating. Before he wrote Working with the Family Afterwards, he went back and read what he had written into Wives, and he thought, I probably should temper that. But as soon as he tempers it, then he runs off into
goes right back to it.
Just goes right back to it. Yeah. So I think he's trying to draw a little bit less accusatory picture of the wife's responsibilities here, her total responsibilities, but he's not doing a good job of it. So
right. I laugh a lot about this. I have to take it with a grain of salt. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
And we're going to Gigi.
Hey everybody, Gigi Alcoholic. I have a different type of question entirely. And that is on page 371, Jim Burwell says they're having the discussion about writing the book, the chapters collectively. And he says, we thought he was really a walking encyclopedia on alcohol. There were only 4 or 5 books and Bill had read them all. Okay, what 4 or 5 books and were they religious?
And were they, what was the second part?
Were they religious? Or how religious were they?
I don't, Jimmy has a list, and maybe Jim knows this exactly, but Jim has a list of like 4 or 5 books that were very, very important to early Alcoholics Anonymous. One of them, of course, is The Common Sense of Drinking by Peabody. But that wasn't particularly religious, or I don't remember it being particularly religious when I read it. Although if there was anything that was coming out of the Emmanuel group, for instance, up in Boston, you guaranteed that was pretty damn religious.
Okay.
But there was also Jim. What are those books? You know those books off the top?
Yeah, I'm trying to look up where I have them, but one was Our Believing World. Of course, the one you mentioned.
Our Believing World was religious. It was kind of broad.
Yeah, kind of a comparative religion thing. He talked about all of the different religions and how the problems they had. I think that one of them was Emmett Fox.
Yeah, Sermon on the
Mount. Yeah, and the other one,
Variety, Religious Experience.
The Varieties. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
there we go. Religious.
Yeah, the varieties of religious experience was the other one.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Gigi, those are the only explicit things I've seen in the records, not only contemporary but after the fact. You know, Jimmy, that comes out of, I think, the Hope Manor talk of 1948, or that he later morphed into the evolution of AA. So there's a little bit two different versions here, but I think that's where where that list, he says, these were the important books we all read. Now there's people who have done a whole bunch of research on the books that Dr. Bob read, but I don't know much about that. And of course, I don't think that impacted much of what went into the big book. So what
Doesn't
Dr.
sound
Bob
like
was
it did.
reading.
Yeah, doesn't sound like it did. So
Bill admitted, by the way, there's someplace where he says Dr. Bob read all that stuff. He read all that stuff. He was always reading that stuff, you know, and but I didn't. So
okay, so I would not really regard varieties of religious experience as religious. He makes a point of saying that it's not meant to be promoting any type of religion. He's just trying to catalog experiences.
right,
But
right.
common sense is probably very definitely also not religious, but Emmett Fox for sure is religious. Emmanuel Group for sure is religious. And I don't know who wrote Our Believing World.
Brown, I think some Brown guy. I think it was Brown, isn't it? I have it here somewhere.
Yeah, Lewis Brown.
Brown, yeah, it was a Brown.
Okay.
I think that's Lewis too. I don't think it's L.
Yeah, it's Lewis and Brown with an E at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, This
Thank you.
Believing World.
Yeah, in the second. GG, Bill, good. Jim, good. Yeah, that's great, guys. That's great.
And Sermon on the Mount, you know, Emmett Fox, as much as religious it might be, it's one of the farthest things from traditional or fundamental religion that you can think of, because, you know, he uses everything as an allegory. You know, the Bible doesn't really mean this. You know, he's not a literalist from the biblical standpoint. Says this is kind of an allegory of things. So he was not, theologically, he was not really what you would call a traditional or a fundamental Christian religion. Emmett Fox.
Good information, guys. Thank you very much. Must listen back. Kit Remsen is in Seattle, who read for us as well today. Hello, Kit.
Thank you. I'm Kit. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you, everybody. Great job today, and great writing again, Bill. I want to take us back to like page 381, where it's been addressing the Hank and Ruth and Kathleen, and where you said the affair is largely, it's anecdotal only. There's no written primary document support of it. And then looking at all the information that we gleaned from Lois's diary in the history of AA, has anyone pursued whether Kathleen kept the diary, and that is like, when did the affair start? When did she become aware of it? Was it the New Year's Eve party at Bill's house right before that she found out? All these things that we've kind of discussed. Did Kathleen write a diary, and has anybody looked for it? Do you know?
Well, there's no knowledge. I've never heard of Kathleen having a diary or even a recording, you know, of no, is that true? No, there's not a recording either of her. There's a recording of who was yeah. Okay. Who is the guy out in Hackettstown, Jim? Who found the psychiatrist?
Silas Bent?
No, it was like Burl or one of those guys. But anyhow, his wife did a recording when she was really old, and she went on the trip out to Ohio in October of 1937. So yeah, Tom Burl. No, somehow there's something wrong.
Might have been
Somebody.
Catherine Rudell.
Rudell. It was. Thank you very much. It was Bill Rudell's wife, Catherine, and she talks about going out to the Ohio, and she talks about typing up some of the manuscript before the multilith was printed. You know, she does that. But I've listened to the recording, and she's, I don't know what year it was. I probably have that someplace in the records, but she was old. You know, she was really talking haltingly and couldn't remember details, and you know, that sort of thing. I can't imagine forgetting details just because you get old, but there it is.
Mhm. And of course, Jim was right in saying Silas Benton wrote the article. Is that right? Silas Benton wrote the article, Jim?
Yeah, about,
Hackettstown.
yeah, Hackettstown.
Just for information. I just looked up your book, Bill Sherwood. So if I'm looking for, I can't find my book about Disbelieving Word, but I find it short. Does anyone else want to ask a question? Because Bill, we've just gone a little bit over. We've got 2 minutes, I think, left for Bill.
Dinner time here in Connecticut.
Yeah, here in Cancun too.
No, let's call it this. Thank you for your time, guys. Appreciate it. I'm very appreciative. Love it. So Bill Sherwood, we're going to go back to you in a second. I just want to show people that you are involved in something coming up soon, aren't you, with Jay Stinnett and Kevin Hanlon. For people who mightn't have seen this in the beginning, the Conscious Contact movie or documentary you were very much involved in. You're going to be doing a panel discussion. You're going to be doing
Yeah, we're gonna be signing books before the movie, and then the movie's from 7 to 8, and from 8 to 9, we're supposedly just going to answer questions about people who might have questions. And I'm always impressed with the creativity of Alcoholics Anonymous questions. Members of AA. I can't tell you how often I'm like, damn, I never thought about that. So that's all to the good. We like that. But some of those things, I mean, Jay and I did a thing in New Jersey, I don't know, 6 or 7 months ago. We showed that movie, and some guy came up to me and he told me that we were going to kill alcoholics by showing him that movie. It's just, you get all kinds of different responses. My biggest challenge is to get through those things without embarrassing myself. So.
Mm-hmm. And just before we go to you, back to you, Bill, to close with the prayer. Jim Worley, just want to mention this again, guys. Jim is doing wonderful work and service. We call it, Jim.
Oh yeah, tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern U.S. time. A short 40-minute talk on Big Book history, myths, legends, and changes.
And a history presentation in honor of Founders Day. I love the fact that it's called Myths, Legends, and Changes. Thank you, Jim Worley, for that. And we're going back to Mr. Sherberg, who we're very much appreciative of here, growing in understanding. We have definitely grown in understanding again today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, David. Thank you for hosting the meeting, putting this all together continually. It's good stuff. Let's have a moment of silence, and then I will share the evening Gatha with you. Let me respectfully remind you, William, life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunities are lost. Each of us should strive to awaken to the present moment. Take heed. This very night, your days are diminished by 1. Do not squander what little life you have left.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone. And of course, we're back next week with chapter 20. We're going into the 20s next week. Hank Parkhurst, managing editor, and 2 employers. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Bill.
Everyone.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
David.
Thank you.
Before next week, same time, same channel.
Thanks, everybody.
See you then.
Bye, Sergio.
Bye, guys.
You.
Bye, everybody.
We're going to pause.